So forgive me, I don't remember the source right now, but I believe Yale did a study where they had papers being written, and the instructors, the professors were very upset that the content was, the quality was very low for these papers. And so they flipped it and said, we're going to publish them on the internet, everyone, and everyone's going to see your work. And of course, their peers could see the work, and upon review, that's all they really cared about. They didn't care if the experts saw that they didn't do a good job. They really cared if their friends saw that they didn't do a good job. I was just talking about the types of forums that Moodle has, and I use the Q&A forum. But most of us are used to the first simple single discussion. I copied this right out of from Moodle. One thing I kind of want to caution here, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is the Q&A forum is not one I would recommend for an online interactive discussion. Q&As are often something where you're trying to get everyone to make an offering, but they don't necessarily start a conversation online. Where they do, but if you want to start it off where everyone can sort of chime in and see each other like they would in a room, it's more like that. Starting with the challenges of the face-to-face, I'm just noticing a lot of the problems that we have are actually the arrangement of a classroom. Changes whether or not people are going to be interactive. We're in a circle, that's great. More of them, sadly, are starting to look like this, larger and larger classrooms. And so the tendency for those people who are less inclined to be vocal to not contribute in these environments is pretty huge. We're trying to get folks to express their opinions, behave intellectually, behave well with each other, articulate what they are trying to say, understand, democratic habits so you don't control the conversation, and give people some respect. So there's a lot behind conversation that isn't about content. It's about soft skills. It's about these other things we're trying to impart, especially in a liberal arts institution. So obviously the pros and cons of face-to-face discussions. The big one is the cons is time constraint. And so face-to-face conversations are going to be a big part of, I hope, of higher education for a long time to come. And they can be now conducted online and using technology to the point where people report they can't separate face-to-face Skype sort of interactions when they're rich enough connections. The information is rich enough. People report having difficulty remembering if they were really face-to-face in a conversation or if they were having a video conversation. So that's interesting. Really thinking about this in your questions and planning your strategy for your conversations is important. Many of you have been doing this for a long time, but I just wanted to mention that it's especially important in the online discussion where you don't have the feedback that you get in a normal human social interaction. So I'm a big fan of rubrics, as I mentioned before. You let them know where they have to get ready. You know what you expect, and they know what they're getting in terms of their contribution. And boy, does it make it easy to quickly get feedback to students when you realize how easy it is to put together a rubric in Moodle and then enact it and actually pull them up year to year and use them in different settings, so you're not inventing the wheel every year. But this is one way to approach it. It really isn't about reading this. This is kind of one style of rubric that was out there. And I think some of these are really for the instructor more than they are for the student. So I caution to write rubrics that make sense to the student from their perspective, whereas I think this style rubric is one where you start from here, but you maybe speak or use a different voice in your rubric to the student. And I think what you have to do is make sure the rubric is vague enough in some respects when you're talking about the contributions. So if you're really detailed in terms of the actual outcome, then you're going to get exactly what you're talking, box ticking. People just like repeating the statement that you put there in the beginning of their sentence in their post. So it's forming, first of all, forming the questions that allow the answers to be created. The rubrics signal basically how you're going to assess their response, versus your expectations of what the response is supposed to be. So a lot of my rubrics will have things like the sources and the citing and the formatting sort of things. You've used at least this many sources. You've gone and done this and that and the other thing, and your argument makes sense. So you'll see here knowledge, understanding, writing skills, application analysis, and so forth. And so when you get to that final column, for instance, just demonstrates exceptional ability to analyze, synthesize student work. You can't tick a box for that unless you're doing it all the way along in your answer. An example I took from one of my courses, and again, they're very vague in terms of my expectations about the arguments. I borrowed from other people's ideas and reconstructed this in true academic fashion. But I use this little trick here that I'm going to point out, and that's I'll use these lists of and that's useful for you, I think, Eudora, when you're like good grammar, spelling, and trying to fit those into the boxes like these arguments are made at the top can be really problematic for assignments. It's like you can't really go ahead and predict all those things. But when you have a list of things that you need to make sure that people are paying attention to, like appropriate target audience, using proper terms, explanation of concepts and jargon, formal tone, you're asking them to do these, then you can say, all right, which of those points have been, you can just say, well, I got 3 out of the 4 or 4 out of the 5. The online discussions, we already started to talk about this, but they can demonstrate their knowledge and have classroom community, think about things, work in terms of consensus building. When you see a thread of a discussion sort of balloon because someone's gotten onto something, other people start to run that thread down, so to speak. This is something in the online community that shy student that Mark spoke of really has the opportunity to become that student leader that they would never become in that social environment. I would say most of the hurdles for technology have been overcome because actually EDUCAUSE puts out a report about technology and teaching, and back in 2013 or 14, it's the first time that they said that smartphones were accessible to all students, that they could not find evidence that based on students' income, they didn't have access to smartphones any more than any other group or class of people. I want to say that phones are uniquely suited for forum interaction for the modern student. They're comfortable with it. They're facile with it. On that point, I wanted to mention, because I wanted to talk about a little bit about how I've been using these forums. And I use the forums after that initial face-to-face discussion. So we watch a video in class, and then when they watch the video, they have to figure it out or fill out one of those KWLs. So what do you know? What do you want to know? And what have you learned from this video? So they have to do something actively, and then we do a little sharing and start a conversation. And generally, it's like an hour and a half to 2 hours in a 3-hour class that I show the video. So the conversations get started, and there's no way to finish them. And so that conversation gets continued online. And if you do not have a requirement for a grade, I don't find that seniors really follow through the discussions. I just want to throw that out there. If you're going to use attachments, ramp it up. Go for the 2 gigabyte. And I like 2 attachments in many cases when we're talking about things, because students will make mistakes. It's a lot simpler in my mind to let them upload the second one. What I kind of do, if I open a new forum and I want to introduce it online, I change from the optional subscription to a forced subscription for the very first post. And so what that does is generate the email. The message has gotten out there. Then I turn it off and I put it to optional subscription. Forced subscription initiates an email, so everybody's been informed. I use the Moodle Gradebook and back it up a lot. You can decide if you want to have ratings. You can show or you can hide a forum. That can be very useful. Removing forums after you're done with a thing is not a bad idea. You can restrict your access so that you can get all your forums all set up ahead of time, and I recommend you try to do that. And then if you know what your schedule is, those forums, boom, just pop up on sort of automatically. And the activity completion is neat too. So if you want to have a conversation after they've accessed something and read it or seen a movie or anything else, you can have it set up on Moodle so that they have to go through that hoop first or take an assessment ahead of time so that you can see what they know about it. I was saying to you before, I use it as a primer, and that seems to work much better. So right now in my sustainable ag course, I assign a reading, have a forum in the Q&A format, and it really does help us start a face-to-face discussion, because then I can, the person who's not willing to say something, it's like, Mark, I know you're not really excited about talking to the group all the time, but I think I'm really excited about your post, and other people who had already read it, and if that energy is already there, it's a really neat way to get that person to feel more confident. And you can keep that discussion going. I talked about that before, and I'd have them actually do an initial post before they left class. And it seemed to me, I don't have good evidence right now, but it seemed to me anecdotally that if they'd done it or started it, then they would be more likely to come back to it and finish it. And in your reply to someone else, you could say, hey, Mike's answer is really good. And when you put Mike's answer and put in a link, then it clicks to there and it brings them over to some other, so you can cite other students. And if it's a big discussion, you can bring them right there with a link. I had my thoughts about why it was useful and what to do. And I have long conversations with Mike about that over the years. And he's guided me a ton to the point where I feel like I really get it. And the thing I want to mention here is that what I've learned about the online experience really has flipped over how I think about teaching when I think about using the online environment. And that is, you really are that guide on the side that we always talk about. You're a facilitator. And the lectures happen in the forums. The lectures happen spontaneously out of people's questions. So the Q&A isn't as useful if you're really trying to get that flow of conversation going, where you as the expert can then reach out with links and things like that and say, really what I was talking about is better explained by these guys. Boom, link, wow, TED Talk. They're watching a TED Talk, or a paper, they're reading a paper that's important about what you're trying to convey. So that's where the content is starting to come up. Or, I've been thinking about it, and it's this way, and the link takes it to your content that you've put together. So I think those are valuable ways to use forums and conversation in and out of classrooms.